Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. My name is Thien Ho. I'm an assistant chief at the Sacramento District Attorney's Office. I oversee our Justice and Community Relations Bureau. As January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, we thought it fitting to talk about these crimes to help raise community consciousness and awareness on this issue. Human trafficking occurs frequently and on a national and global scale. Traffickers often use force, violence, fraud, and coercion for the purpose of sexual exploitation of others. So today, in recognition of Human Trafficking Awareness Month, we are shining the spotlight on this crime and those who help combat it. Our special guests today are Ashlie Bryant, the co-founder, president, and CEO of 3Strands Global Foundation, and Deputy District Attorney Courtney Martin, who is assigned to the Human Trafficking Unit at the Sacramento District Attorney's Office. Let me start with Ashlie. Ashlie, can you please introduce yourself to our audience and talk about yourself and your organization?
Yeah, you bet. Thank you so much for having me today. And I think January is always for us an important month all over the U.S. As we raise the level of awareness about human trafficking. So thanks for having this podcast and including 3Strands as a part of it. For me, really, the 3Strands focuses in on two different areas under the umbrella of prevention. So we focus in missionally on prevention education, which means K-12 schools, corporations, communities, parents, et cetera, that we want to make sure that we prevent human trafficking from happening to our youth. And then we focus in prevention through employment, through our employment program called Employ Plus Empower, which is a program we deliver in both San Francisco as well as Sacramento and have for 5 years. The prevention education program is Protect, and that is a nationwide program that we've rolled out through more than 9 states as well. So that's missionally what we focus on. And then for me, why I got involved in this movement really starts with lived experience of someone who is really dear to me. And that was my dear friend whose daughter at 17 was trafficked. And that experience and what she went through, and really all the survivors for the last 12 years who've shared their lived experience with me and our staff at 3Strands, fuels us to do this work and to focus in on prevention. So that really ignited in me the advocacy that I'd always had for children and for those who are vulnerable, to be able to step into this movement and make a difference as we combat trafficking.
So how long has your organization been in existence?
Yeah, 12 years this May. So it'll be May 25th.
In terms of, can you describe in terms of your organization, how many people does it employ, and kind of elaborate a little bit about where your prevention program or education program is currently being utilized?
Yeah, absolutely. So 3Strands has 23 staff that work in and around the United States. We have different offices in Utah as well as in Ohio and also Texas and in California. And our work, and mostly the national work, is around Protect, the prevention education program, which is our K-12 training for teachers and all staff, as well as the curriculum that is taught by teachers or counselors to the students directly. And then the Employ Plus Empower program, our office here in Sacramento, we actually have served 375 survivors and at-risk individuals and clients by delivering sustainable jobs. to them. And then in addition, launched the San Francisco office this last year during COVID and have been as successful in San Francisco as Sacramento. And super, our staff couldn't be more proud of the clients and the work that they do, the hard work they do to be able to get to that place of sustainability on their own, and the great work that they do as they start their new job and or start at the beginning of education as well. So really in the work that we do, 23 staff members oversee these two programs of Protect plus Employ plus Empower.
Can you give us a description of the education program or a component of 3Strands and how it combats human trafficking?
Yeah, you bet. So the Protect program was actually a co-founded program, and we have a joint venture. 3Strands manages it fiscally as well as across the United States from an implementation perspective. But our co-founders were Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives and Love Never Fails. And I bring that up because I think it doesn't happen very often, right? Where there is this collaborative effort within nonprofits really digging down deep to be able to put things together. But Protect was originally launched that way, and the purpose of Protect is to make sure that an entire school staff first starts with a protocol. So the very first step is making sure that a protocol is set, that net is underneath our youth, and that teachers and counselors and other staff know what to do if they identify or someone self-identifies as a victim of human trafficking, so that survivor can get the resources that they need in order to really meet the needs that they have, whether that's trauma or whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, that the school is then the net for that student. So the first part is protocol. The second piece is training. That means from our yard duty staff to our cafeteria staff to our teachers to our counselors to our nurses, everyone is trained through Human Trafficking 101, 102, and 103. And that is all a trauma-informed based program within Protect. Then once everyone is trained, then there is a K3, a 4-6, a 7-8, and a 9-12 curriculum, which is 5. It rounds out at 5 different curricula through the student's life that builds from kindergarten all the way. And they don't need to have it from kindergarten until 12th grade, but it builds on itself. And it's really about the value and the worth of an individual, and how is it that they are safe, and what does it mean to be safe, and what does it mean, and what might a perpetrator or a trafficker or an exploiter, what are the tactics of those individuals, and how do we make sure that we build not only the school safety around that individual, but that we empower that student to also understand and recognize what exploitation looks like.
Well, that sounds like a tremendously comprehensive program that you have there. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Courtney, let's talk a little bit about what you do at the DA's office. What kind of cases do you prosecute?
Yes, so I'm assigned to the Human Trafficking Unit. So I handle all of the human trafficking cases where we're prosecuting exploiters. And as you mentioned at the beginning, human trafficking is defined as basically when someone uses coercion, some sort of threats, force, fraud, etc., in order to force someone to engage in commercial sex work or to engage in some sort of labor. So any case where there's an exploiter who's doing that, that's going to come to my unit. And then we also handle cases of pimping and pandering. Pimping and pandering are, not used colloquially a lot in regular conversation, but those are crimes that focus not so much on the coercion aspect, but on the exploiter's activity of facilitating, encouraging, promoting, and then benefiting from the prostitution of the victim. So sometimes it's hard to prove the coercion aspect for a variety of reasons. And that's where we'll charge and pursue pimping and pandering crimes so that we can still prosecute the exploiter and make sure that the victim is safe. But in cases where we can't quite meet that burden of showing coercion. And so we handle cases that involve adults as well as juvenile victims.
In your current assignment, Courtney, how do you help curtail human trafficking specifically?
Right. So we look at this problem sort of from 3 sides. There's the demand side, so that's sex buyers. there is the distribution side, that's the exploiter. And then there's the supply side, that's, unfortunately the victim. And so we're looking at opportunities to engage with all three sides of this issue and to curtail all of them. So in my assignment as a prosecutor, of course, my first priority is to address that, what I call the distribution side. So address exploiters and prosecuting them, making sure that they can no longer victimize vulnerable people. But then we also work with law enforcement to address the demand side. So we engage with law enforcement about their sting operations that they're doing. And when I say demand side, what I'm talking about is primarily sex buyers. So those who are out there basically contributing a huge amount of money to this problem and incentivizing exploiters to take advantage of vulnerable young people. And then in my job, I also have the opportunity, of course, to speak with victims. And so our team here at the DA's office is always promoting connecting victims with services. So we connect with different nonprofits in our community to make sure that when we do come in contact with a victim through our cases, that our interaction is not only and primarily about the case, but it's also about making sure that when they step away from this criminal forum, that they have services.
Now, this question goes to both of you because you're both so involved in terms of combating human trafficking, and you're really subject matter experts on the area. What are the current trends you are seeing by those who are perpetrating these types of crimes? And I'll start off with Ashlie.
Yeah. So for us, on the education side and in the schools, because of COVID and the pandemic, we just saw this explosion of online exploitation, 100-fold. And we are hearing from youth in the classroom, as well as from teachers and parents, that this is a gateway to our youth, and that exploitation has been on the rise. So I think perpetrators took advantage of shelter in place, as well as kids being online all the time, and making it easier to be able to have access to them. So that's the first. The second, in our Employ Plus Empower program, what we saw was the vulnerability of our clients being exploited by perpetrators. So financially or fear mongering, being able to make it so that the perpetrator became the one to be dependent upon, so that the victim felt like they had no other place to go because of their vulnerability. So those are sort of what I would say are the two out of our two programmatic places that we've seen the most explosion of growth.
Thank you. Courtney, what about you?
Well, I'll piggyback on what Ashlie said in terms of the internet. The biggest trend that I focus on when I speak to community groups is the fact that the internet is a tool for recruiting and grooming vulnerable young people and making them trafficking victims. And so we see exploiters reaching out on very commonly used platforms like Facebook and Instagram in order to recruit victims. We're also seeing a lot of recruitment over dating sites. I had a detective who put up an undercover profile on a dating site, and within minutes he was being pandered. He was being recruited by potential exploiters who wanted him to become a commercial sex worker for them. And so, if you think that this is something that's rare or an aberration, or you think, your child can just avoid it by being smart, that's probably not true. They're probably going to have someone reach out to them at some point. So it's going to be really important to have education like what 3Strands provides, so that when a child is contacted by an exploiter, they know how to respond, because if they're on social media, they're going to be contacted. And then the second trend that we see is really the use of manipulation by exploiters. And actually, this is also what Ashlie is touching on when she says that the exploiter makes themselves the person that the victim is reliant on. And so we see that in a variety of ways. There's this picture in the community that human trafficking is people getting snatched from a Walmart parking lot, and they're, taken to some garage somewhere. They're locked away. They're put in chains, and so they can't escape. And what we see primarily is that exploiters are very adept at using the emotional vulnerabilities of these victims. A lot of times these victims have a background that involves emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, neglect by family, a lack of support system, a lack of vocational training and education. So exactly what 3Strands is trying, the gap that 3Strands is filling there is exactly the vulnerability that we see in our victims. And then the exploiter comes in and tries to fill those emotional gaps, and also at the same time isolates the victim from family and support that the victim already has. The exploiters often play on the shame of the victim. So a lot of these victims carry a great deal of shame because of past trauma that they've suffered, and then the current trauma of being a prostituted person. And so the exploiters, they use that. No one wants you. No one is going to want you. I'm the only one who you can depend on. So it's very, very important for the community to recognize that when we're looking for signs of human trafficking, what we're looking for is signs of that emotional manipulation. We're not looking for chains and locks. We're looking for these emotional barriers that the exploiter creates.
I think too, I'm going to interrupt for a second because I want to piggyback for a minute on what Courtney said. That coercion piece that Courtney talked about in the very beginning of this conversation, which is really hard to be able to for kids or for youth or for even adults or those who are vulnerable to be able to understand sometimes that they're being coerced. I think that's why it's so important for us as to be able to raise the level of awareness of human trafficking, because it's true. What we're seeing in the world is this coercion by perpetrators, whether online or in person, taking advantage of, just like Courtney said, those who have vulnerabilities. And we all have different vulnerabilities. It's just the perpetrator figuring out what is that vulnerability and then exploiting it. So I think that the coercion part is very misunderstood in this movement. And I think that that's the piece that today is so important for us to emphasize, that people do understand what does coercion look like, and have conversations. In our Protect program, we actually do different role plays so that kids can understand what coercion actually is.
And I'll say too, if I can just say one thing, I really love what Ashlie was saying about teaching kids what safety looks like. Because instead of just saying avoid these types of people, say this is what safe adults look like. This is what's the way safe adults will interact with you. Because good manipulators will know how to shut down the red flags that kids expect to see. But I think instead, if you teach them what to look for that's positive, that's very, very helpful.
So thank you so much for talking about those manipulation ploys and the coercion. So Ashlie, can we talk a little bit about what 3Strands does to address intervention and prevention, but specifically as it relates to the manipulation and the coercion? And you talked about role playing. Can you give us some examples of how 3Strands deals with those particular issues of coercion and manipulation?
Yeah. So as a teacher or counselor goes into the classroom to teach this curriculum, and I talked about, starting when they're young, but even if they don't, the idea and concept of inner voice is throughout all of the 5 curricula for our youth. And so if you think about the inner voice, it's the inner watchdog. And what we want them to recognize is that's their safety. When that actually is, when they're feeling their inner voice, whether it feels like uncomfortable or it feels they're sick or they're butterflies or something just isn't right in that gut, right? We want them to be able to recognize that as something to tell a trusted adult. So what we role play is, if someone is trying to, and we'll take an online scenario, they've befriended you online, and they said that they're a friend of a friend. And now the definition of a friend is so different from when I was their age, of what a friend might be that you would see in person and you play sports with, or you call on the phone that had a cord attached to it, right? But now friends, how many friends I have is actually a social status. And so we tell them, there is someone who's befriended you, and it's a friend of a friend, and they want to be able to go and hang out at the school. And before that, they start to ask you different questions about yourself. What are you interested in? And they seem like a friend. They'll ask you questions just like any normal friend might ask you. And they don't, like, right off the bat are scary or don't seem like they would take advantage of you, because they are wise and savvy enough to be able to ask the right questions to not terrify a youth, but to be able to actually be their friend, right? That's that manipulation that they're really good at, the perpetrators are. And so we go through this process of, someone actually role playing being a friend online, but it's really a 50-some-year-old person who is who is a perpetrator. And as that person, first starts to be able to say, oh my gosh, I took a picture of my foot today. This is the manipulator, exploiter. And it's really, it's a funny picture. Can I share it with you? I mean, it seems innocent, right? Of just somebody's foot. But all of a sudden that picture of the foot, can you show me your foot? Right? And slow and steady, there's a picture of a foot. And then it leads to a picture of a little bit more, and maybe a little bit more. And all of a sudden, this youth, what Courtney talked about, the shame starts to come and enter from the youth of, oh my gosh, I don't know who to go to or who to talk to. And so now I'm feeling trapped. And so we teach them, it's that inner voice, right? That feeling is then when you do go to someone, whether it's teacher, counselor, parent, coach, faith, your pastor, or whomever that might be, that's safe for you. And we describe, like Courtney said, what is a safe person? What are the characteristics of a safe person? What does a safe person do and not do? So that then they can, in that role play, say, almost touching the red button, I need to be able to go to that trusted adult now, because this person has asked me for a picture that's revealing that is not okay. And so I am feeling shame. I'm feeling manipulation in this space, because that's what you've helped me to see what manipulation is. And so it's really a process. It's not a one and done, but through this curricula process journey to protect, they really understand, how do I put that, what we say is like a hula hoop around themselves, that hula hoop that says there's this distance, whether it be online or in person, that you have the ability to use tools to ask questions or to be able to say no firmly and strongly, because you feel that inner voice speak up and say, this isn't right.
Great. Thank you. So Courtney, what about you? What do you do as a prosecutor in our human trafficking unit to engage in intervention and prevention of this crime?
Well, again, the most obvious is by aggressively prosecuting exploiters. So that's my first goal. And one of the things I love about this kind of anti-trafficking community is that it is very collaborative, and we all are good at seeing what our lanes are. And so my lane is primarily focusing on making sure that exploiters cannot continue their activities. And so we do that by making sure that they're speedy and efficient arrests, making sure that the exploiter stays in custody while the case is pending, so that they can't continue to exploit or manipulate that victim or that survivor. And then, of course, we pursue significant prison sentences, because these are very serious crimes. But then we also get to collaborate with other groups to work on those other sides, the victim side and also the demand side. So here at the DA's office, we have a victim advocate who's assigned to human trafficking, and that advocate just really creates a relationship with the victim, and so that they know their needs, they can connect them with a specific nonprofit or specific government resource that can address their needs. And then also just help them through the court process, because the court process is very emotionally draining for anyone, especially someone who has a lot of, who's coming into this process with a lot of complex trauma. And then we also collaborate with nonprofits. We work a lot with CASH, Community Against Sexual Harm, which is a great nonprofit here in Sacramento. One just quick example: a few months ago, we had an interview with a young lady, and I was there watching the interview with the detectives. And she had left her trafficking situation, but she was the situation that she was in was not safe. And so as we were talking to her, it became very clear we can't take her back to the situation that she was in. And so it was this urgent need of like, she needs housing right now. She needs a place to stay, not even tonight, but like in an hour. And so it was great to be able to reach out to Cash and City of Refuge and get her placed in emergency housing right then. So I do not know what we would do without our community partners who provide those emergency crisis support for us. We also here at the DA's office have our reset court. Reset is a diversion court. So if someone is arrested for prostitution, selling sex, then they have the opportunity to participate in that court. There's a 25-hour class that is put on by Cash. And they also have some other terms and conditions that they have to abide by, all focused on trying to help them get out of this lifestyle and get to a safer place. And if they complete that, then their case is dismissed. And then on the other side as well, once this kind of journey has been going on a little bit longer for them, then there's an opportunity for vacatur. Vacatur is a very unique and specific law regarding human trafficking. It allows for prior criminal convictions that were the result of the trafficking situation to be not just dismissed or expunged, but to actually be completely wiped clean. So the record of the arrest is destroyed. Any agency that has any record has to completely destroy that record. The Department of Justice has to write any records off that person's rap sheet. And so it really gives a chance at a new start for folks who have some entanglement with the criminal justice system. And so I really love my opportunity in my spot to read those petitions, because in those petitions, the survivor outlines what the trafficking situation was that led to the criminal conviction. So maybe it's a conviction for prostitution, or maybe it's a conviction for a drug offense, a theft offense, something like that. But then they show where they've come since then. So they talk about their journey to get out of the life, to find healing, to find themselves, and what they're doing now. And more often than not, they're really giving back to their community in some very meaningful way. And so that's probably my favorite part of my job, getting to read those petitions and see where these survivors can be in 10 and 15 years as they find support and move on to a better place in their life.
So, Courtney, you talk about collaboration. Ashlie, in regards to 3Strands, does your organization collaborate with other agencies or organizations to deter human trafficking, and how so?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, our Employ Plus Empower program that's in Sacramento and San Francisco, we work alongside 60 different agencies. And those agencies can refer to 3Strands, to our Employ Plus Empower program. And like Courtney said, reset or probation or juvenile justice, right? All can refer into our program. And then we meet the survivor where they're at. But we have a communication. We often have a release of information between the nonprofit and 3Strands so that we can make sure to collaboratively sit with the client to make sure we're meeting their needs. And all of those different agencies we can refer to, they can refer to us, and we have this net in Sacramento. It's really quite beautiful. Sacramento Together is another place where our agencies can sit and share best practices as well as what's happening and what we're seeing on the ground in Sacramento, which is really important, I think, for not only all of us in the movement, but as we are understanding better what perpetrators are doing and sort of new tactics, it's helpful to be able to communicate in that space. But I would say that with Employ Plus Empower, one of the joys of the many of seeing clients succeed in employment or education is to work alongside other nonprofits as we do that.
Ashlie talked about SAC Together. Courtney, can you elaborate a little bit about SAC Together and the district attorney's role in regards to SAC Together?
Yes. So SAC Together was started in 2016, I believe, and it's a collaborative effort. It's headed by the DA's office to bring together nonprofits as well as law enforcement. So we have a meeting with all of the nonprofits in the region, as well as all the law enforcement agencies 4 times a year. And at that meeting, we essentially talk about what each organization is doing. And then there's an opportunity to connect and communicate. During COVID, it's been more difficult because we're mostly on Zoom. But certainly before COVID, when we were able to meet in person, there was so many fantastic conversations that went on individually as well when the meeting ended, so that everyone could exchange business cards and do follow up with each other. And I think what's really great about SAC Together, there's about, I think, something like 50 organizations that at least are in the email chain. And in this world, you kind of don't know who you need until you need them. And so you'll hear somebody mention what their organization does, and maybe they're small and don't have a lot of resources, and you think, okay, you kind of put it in the back of your mind. And then all of a sudden you come across a scenario and you're like, oh, that's that organization. That's who we need. A couple months ago, we had a situation where a victim needed some legal support that was separate from the criminal case because of some things that were happening that were related to her trafficking situation, but not directly related to the criminal case. And so one of the detectives reached out over the SAC Together list thread and asked if anyone knew of any pro bono legal services for her. And within, I think, 30 minutes, there was a connection for her to receive that legal help. So it is a very effective tool to connect with each other, so that then we can connect the folks that we work with the right support.
Great, thank you. Ashlie, can you discuss some of the red flags that the community should be watching for as it relates to human trafficking?
Yeah. So, and I'm going to do both labor trafficking as well as commercial sexual exploitation, because I think it's really important that we remember that this umbrella term of human trafficking includes both forced labor as well as commercial sexual exploitation. So some of the signs that someone's being exploited: debt bondage, meaning they're having to pay off somebody in order to be free, right? That would be one. Over controlling employer or partner, someone who doesn't give direct eye contact while they have someone, whether boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other, next to them who may be their trafficker or exploiter. Visible signs of branding. This is one to be cautious of, obviously, because tattoos are great and people have all sorts of different types of tattoos, but something that may be specific to a name or a crown with different jewels in it. We've seen different survivors, lived experience experts that have shared with us their branded tattoos that were by their exploiter or by their trafficker. The other is tense or fearful behavior would be another one. A second cell phone is as also one that we have seen, as well as possession of a fake ID. Sudden possession of expensive material items is another one. Surprising change in friendships or relationship with peers. That isolation that Courtney talked about before. Promiscuous behavior, references to sexual activity with either in person or online. Someone the other day said to me, gosh, I've heard a lot in colleges this term sugar daddy. Ashlie, can you explain that to me? And so, if someone was to use some terminology that sounded something different, that might be something also of a sign to be able to explore a little bit more. Someone who speaks in a scripted manner is another. And then someone who's fearful of law enforcement or security personnel is another red flag as well.
Great. Courtney, what can the community do to help in our efforts to combat human trafficking?
Well, starting with Ashley's list and being aware of those things, I think, are very important. And we can hopefully put on our page when we publish this, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. If you see something, you can certainly call that. The biggest way, I think, is by supporting young people who are at risk. So just like Ashlie has said, that prevention is the best way to stop human trafficking. And we all probably have some exposure, some experience with youth that are at risk. I talked about earlier some of those risk factors of prior abuse. Foster youth are at risk for being trafficked. Those who have a history or are currently runaways, homelessness, lack of education. all of those are risk factors for trafficking. And so I think it's very important that the community is looking for ways to intervene for those youth before they become trafficking victims. And so, I see people posting things online and hashtagging Save the Children. And I always just think you would be doing much more to intervene with human trafficking if you were working with if you invited your neighbor who your 17-year-old neighbor, the friend of your daughter, if you invited that person over for dinner and welcomed her into your family, that would do a lot more than posting something on the internet, because those youth really are looking for the support of homes and teachers. And that's why they find themselves vulnerable to someone who offers that and is actually an exploiter.
And Ashlie, what about you? Are there things in the community that you can think of that they can do to help in terms of your efforts and our efforts to kind of combat human trafficking?
Yeah, no, I think Courtney's answers are spot on. I think that, the National Trafficking Hotline will post, because that's a really important piece. If you see something, you say something, right? And you report it, and you're anonymous. And so you can, whatever it is, give as many details as possible. If you're in the community and you see something that your own inner voice or gut says something's not right, then you make that phone call and you report everything you see in the details so that those on the other end can do something about it. I think is important. The other piece is get involved with the nonprofits who do this work, right? There's so many. Courtney talked about SAC Together and 50 different organizations. And they're amazing nonprofits doing really amazing things within the 4 Ps of, the anti-trafficking movement of prosecution, prevention, partnerships, and protection. And so pick one of those nonprofits to come alongside and volunteer your time. And like Courtney said too, I agree 100%. For those who are vulnerable, if there are places where you can be a mentor or you can step in and provide, whether it's care or just a listening ear, sometimes, that relationship means so much and can change a person's life so quickly. And so I think in our community, especially Sacramentoans, are so good about being there for our community. And so just to be able to say, this is not so scary that you can't step in and do something. And I would encourage you to do that. And then the last thing I would say is we've got to get through the myths and get to the facts instead of the fiction as it relates to human trafficking. We began this by saying this is not something that's a take and grab crime. This is not a stranger danger thing. This is not chains locked up to a bed. This is manipulation, coercion, force, fraud, and coercion, right? That's what this is. And the more that we understand what it truly is and isn't, we do a better service for our community on the whole.
Absolutely. I know that a couple of years ago, our district attorney's office here in Sacramento, we actually partnered with some hotel associations in town to talk about if you see it, say something about it, in terms of, because a lot of human trafficking occurs sometimes in hotels and motels. And that is a location where we can try to intervene and stop this and get law enforcement involved and help the victims and survivors of human trafficking. Is there anything else that either of you would like to add to this podcast or say?
Well, I just want to wholeheartely agree with what Ashlie said, that there are a lot of myths out there about what human trafficking looks like, about what prostitution looks like. And it's very, very important that if there's going to be real progress on this issue, that the community understands what human trafficking actually looks like. And so I would encourage everyone, this podcast hopefully is a good start, but there's other great resources. The Polaris Project has some very good information. And there's a lot of good information out there, even on our website and on the SAC Together website. And so it's important to be educated. And I would also just add, we've touched on this in terms of manipulation, but there's a lot of crossover between human trafficking relationships and domestic violence relationships. In fact, a lot of cases that come to our unit come in and law enforcement has identified it as domestic violence, but in reality, the relationship is an exploiter, an exploited person relationship. But often these victims will identify their exploiter as their boyfriend, and they have a form of romantic relationship that the exploiter is using to coerce and control that victim. And so when we're talking about red flags, if there's someone in your life who you think they're in a domestic violence relationship, it's possible that is really one layer of an exploitative relationship, in fact. And so I think it's important when we're talking about education and dispelling the myths to understand that dynamic and understand the cycle of violence, that these exploiters will abuse their victim, and then they'll come back with apologies. They'll come back saying that they'll change, things will be better, and they'll kind of lure their victim back to them, only to repeat that cycle of exploitation and violence. It happens in domestic violence relationships, and it happens in human trafficking relationships. And so I want people to know that profile and be able to identify it when they see it.
Yeah. And I think the other piece of that is, just to piggyback, is that root causes, right? When we look at what are the root causes that actually make it so that someone is vulnerable to trafficking. I mean, there are lots of them, but if you think about, education as lack of education or poverty or immigration status or environmental conditions, right? Some of those root causes, domestic violence, sexual abuse, neglect, and those things can be the root cause of then trafficking actually happening. I mean, I think that's important for our listeners to understand that, and because that dispels the myth that I talked about just a minute ago. And then the other piece is that this is a grooming process for a perpetrator, right? Their goal is to run a business. And that business includes making sure that I groom the person, my victim, to do and be compliant to how I want them to do what I want them to do. And so that grooming process takes time. Sometimes it's faster for some and longer for others. But I think that it's also important for the listeners to understand that again, this is a crime where someone is trying to profit from the exploitation of a vulnerable individual. And so grooming is a part of that process. The only other thing I would say is we have a community training on our website. If I would be remiss, our marketing people would say, Ashlie, how come you didn't say anything? So if people go to the 3Strands website, they can get to the community training as well as some of the resources that we have there and information on Protect as well as Employ Plus Empower too. So
I'm going to check that out.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you to Ashlie and Courtney so much for not only your great work in our community in terms of combating human trafficking, but for taking time out today to really educate our listeners in regards to this crisis that is going on in our community, both on the state, on the local, state, national, and global scale. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thanks, Ashlie.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Courtney. Thanks, Thien.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.